Well, good evening. Good to, I would say, see all of you, but we know that's not true because I can't see you. But I know you're out there somewhere, and so thanks for being here tonight virtually to be able to watch the class and listen. Um, what we'll be talking about tonight and for the next, I guess, 13 or so Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock is the book of Ephesians. That's the class that we'll have, just in case you were curious and you didn't see the announcements. We'll be talking about Ephesians. So this is going to be a little bit different, of course. We've already had classes online, but I have not taught a class yet virtually, and so it's a little bit different. I can't see if you're sleeping out there, and I need to wave my arms really, really big, or if you're actually paying attention. So I'm just going to hope you're paying attention anyway. But even though this will be a little bit weird and who knows, that may be a little clunky for me since I haven't been doing this type of class before. We'll at least get to study together and hopefully learn some things, find some encouragement from the book of Ephesians. And so I'm excited about that. I think that'll be really good. So, so we'll have about 13 classes. Of course, this first class is going to be all about the introduction to the book, introduction to, who the Ephesians were, and the ancient city of Ephesus, some things about it. And then we'll get into the text and we'll really be able in some places to go fairly quickly through it, and then in others really dive deep into some of the things that I think are very relevant and will be helpful to talk about. So, but the goal of this class, of course, is always to make sure that you are encouraged to live your lives for God, and to really think about us, as Christians, how we are to behave, how we are to act, how we are to even think, and how we can be not just of encouragement to each other, but of benefit to each other and the world and to God's kingdom. So those are the things that hopefully we will get out of this. There will be lots of encouragement from this study. I really hope for you. So in looking at the kind of summarizing, thinking about what Ephesians is all about, because I will tell you Ephesians is always relevant. All the books of the Bible, if you read them and study them, you see how relevant God's word is, no matter where we are in human history. Ephesians, however, is ever more relevant as we really are going to discuss unity. You see the title of the class, unity is such a big theme in the book of Ephesians. And, what we're going to see is that really that theme of unity starts early on in Ephesians. It's not just when we hit chapter 4 and you see that word out there. It's really earlier than that. But there are a lot of things going on in our culture and our country, specifically here in America that I think if we will go to God's word, and specifically here in the book of Ephesians, it'll help us understand better how we should react to the things that are out there happening right now, and it'll help us understand just how we are to be as Christians. How do you interpret all these things that are going on? Well, you can't interpret it well without, or even right, I'll say, without looking to God's word and understanding really what he says and what he wants for us to do and to be. So Ephesians is going to have a lot of relevance in our lives, and I hope that'll be helpful to you as it's been to me. So when we look at Ephesians, just kind of summarizing really what Ephesians is all about, the very beginning of Ephesians in the first chapter, there's going to be a laying of the groundwork, laying of the foundation of unity. As Paul is going to talk about, he's going to talk about, God. God is our foundation, and everything he's done through us, for us, through Jesus. And it's not, you'll see this multiple times in the first chapter. It's not what he's done for some of us. It's what he's done for all of us. All. You see that word all over and over again in the book of Ephesians, in the first chapter in particular. And there's a reason for that. We're laying the groundwork for unity, that we are all included in what God has to offer us, in this opportunity to be a part of a faith that he is, really where he's giving us this incredible gift but it's for all of us, not just for some of us. And so that's, I think, where he's going to lay a lot of groundwork. Paul's going to talk about the result of their faith. It's encouraging to him too. But he's also going to talk about other things that they need to understand about God and about Christ. And he's going to talk to them about more reasons they can't really separate themselves from their other brethren who aren't exactly the same as them. When we start to talk about Jews and Gentiles, even though we have these two groups, they really, really are one in what they share in Christ and the faith that they share. So that's what we're really going to get into a lot as you move through the first chapter and into the second chapter. He's going to really get into some of those things, talking about how loving and merciful God is, and he's the reason for their hope, and that they are alive, resurrected like Jesus. There's going to be a lot of talk about, being a new man and being a new person, which when we get there, we'll discuss kind of how difficult that would really be to understand, what it should really look like for the Ephesians, not just for the Ephesians, but for a lot of Gentile converts of that time. And how different that really would be to think differently the way he's saying, you're a new person when you are in Christ. And so there's going to be a lot going on through that. He's going to talk about how Gentiles were outside of God's covenant, but now they are in God's covenant, which is going to be a stark contrast from what they understood in the first place, before Jesus died and resurrected for them. And Paul's going to talk about how he was chosen to reveal these things to the Gentiles. He's really going to get into unity when we get into chapter 4. He's going to talk about being tossed back and forth by every wind of doctrine, which I think is interesting. We may spend a little bit of time on that when we get there. And then he's going to go in just to what it's like to be a new person in Christ. I mean, what is that like? What does that look like in your day-to-day actions and activities, and how they had to leave behind their past, and the way they viewed the world and who they should have been in the world. So the book of Ephesians is going to have a lot of specifics like that. And of course, we get to the end of Ephesians, everybody remembers the armor of God, and how we're going to talk about that some too, and what they need to equip themselves with to be able to do the things that he's telling them they need to do, and think the way that they need to think. So it's hopefully going to be for all of you a beneficial study and encouraging as we get through this entire book of Ephesians. So I really appreciate everybody tuning in. This will be really good. I'm just excited about it. So, okay, so let's talk about Ephesians, the content of Ephesians. Let's go there for a minute. So, Ephesians is really a very general epistle, very general letter. When you compare that letter to a lot of Paul's other writings, Paul gets very specific to the people he's writing to. And, he says, very specifically calls certain people out, calls people out for specifically things that they are doing. 1 Corinthians comes to mind about things he's talking about the church they're doing that they should not be doing anymore. Ephesians is a lot more general than that. Ephesians is one that you would say doesn't quite fulfill those expectations of the other, writings of Paul. And so there's been some question about, well, okay, was Ephesians, that letter really meant to go to the Ephesians? Is that what it's meant to, where it was meant to go? And there's, a legitimate question there being asked. In some of the earliest manuscripts, the words in Ephesus, the letter to the Ephesians. So in the first verse of the first chapter of Ephesians, the words in Ephesus aren't there in some of those early manuscripts, which is kind of interesting. Now it's in a whole lot more as well, but some of the early ones it's not, and so that calls to question. People would say, well, was this a letter that was actually meant to only go to the Ephesians? And that maybe not. I will say, a lot of the early writers, post-apostolic writers, of course, they regarded this as a work of Paul. They regarded it as something that went to the Ephesians, but it's possible, and I don't think it's unlikely that this letter was one that was meant for a lot of different churches, because of the general nature of the content. Certainly meant to go to the Ephesians, but also to go to other Gentile Christians, new converts to Christianity, just based on the content that's in there. And you can make that argument because there's a lot of churches that would have benefited from this exact message that Paul is putting out there. So it's kind of interesting thinking of it a little bit differently in that way, and you're welcome to study it as much as you'd like and figure that out. But I do think this is meant for the Ephesians as well. So I think that's something we can continue on, because that's something I'm focused on. It's meant to go to the Ephesians. So now when we look at a date for Ephesians, there are some people who will say, well, they actually think this was written post AD 70. Post AD 70, because in chapter 2 and verse 14 of Ephesians, you have this reference to breaking down of a wall. And since there's this breaking down of a wall, maybe it's kind of talking about the destruction in Jerusalem. And if it is, well, then that would be a clear reference to it. And so maybe this is post AD 70. But what I'd say about that is, to look at one particular reference to a wall that is broken down, some dividing wall that has been broken down, and say that this is how it had to be interpreted, I don't think is really the best argument for something like that. And so I wouldn't jump on that date for that reason. But the other, big reason is, we know when Paul died. Paul died in AD 63. So a lot of folks that I have read that would say, well, we think it was written AD 70 or later after that, are people who aren't really considering this as Paul's authorship. That Paul didn't write this letter; it was somebody else. And so sometimes those folks are starting from that point and then moving to the date, as opposed to those of us who say, well, no, we believe Paul wrote the letter and we think that's clear, and so he obviously had to write it before he died. Although that would have been a miracle, not impossible to come back from the dead and write it, but I'm sure that's not what happened. So we know that Paul, died. He was executed in Rome in AD 63. We know he spent 2 years in a Caesarean prison. When he was in Rome earlier too, he had spent some time in prison in Rome. I don't think the entire time, but some of that time. And so Ephesians would have been written, somewhere, we think, it's 61 to 63 AD. So the last couple of years of Paul's life is really, I think, where we're looking at. There are other writings of Paul's that you would consider his, writings sent in captivity. So Ephesians is, of course, one of those, but the others are, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And those, I believe, were written earlier, like mid-50s, 50 AD earlier. And so, if you could prove that all those letters were sent, from the same place at the same time, then okay, Ephesians would be roped in there. But it's something we can't prove. And something too to consider when you look at the different writings of Paul. A lot of people feel like Ephesians is one of those where he's more toned down, mellow, and so maybe that represents him being a little bit older, continuing to gain in wisdom and experience, and that's kind of why that letter has a little bit different of a feel to it as well, that it was written later than a lot of his others. So, and one other thing to consider is when you're thinking about a date and kind of what was going on at the time, there doesn't seem to be in the book of Ephesians a lot of anxiety for spreading the gospel for the people that he's talking to. Of course, we know that Paul received persecution that was certainly connected to his teachings, is in particular to the Gentiles. So we know that's the case. But Ephesians doesn't really read with a lot of focus on the persecution that the people he's talking to are going to face as a result of their faith, like some of his other letters do, that make that make that point just very prominent in some of those letters. But that's just not the case in Ephesians quite as much. And so when we look at we think, we talk about the date. When we look at the internal history on Ephesus, or, the Ephesians, we know Paul spent a couple of years there. Acts chapter 19 and verse 10 tells us that. And there are, of course, other things in Acts that happened. So I have Acts 18, 19 and 20, that you've got Paul founded a church there. Obviously, he worked extensively among the Jews and the Gentiles. We know he performed a lot of miracles when he was there. And he performed miracles, if you go back to Acts and you read it, he performed miracles to the point where people who were considered magicians, grabbed all their books and were ready to burn them. And not just ready, they did burn them. I mean, they did. It's just a big public burning of a lot of books, which, of course, gained a lot of negative attention for Paul from others in the area. But it says it was worth a lot of money. So, the clear point was they considered their books of magic worthless compared to what they saw Paul doing when he was in Ephesus. And so, you got to think a little bit while we read this letter of what else happened in Ephesus, before they received this letter, when Paul was there earlier. What all happened there? And he of course made a pretty big splash when he was in Ephesus, as we saw, of course, throughout a lot of those areas, but Ephesus in particular, that Christianity really took hold and started to spread as a result of the work that he did. So those are some of the internal things regarding the the city of Ephesus, and I say internal meaning in the Bible. So let's talk for just a couple of minutes about authorship. So authorship, I of course believe Paul is the author of Ephesians. I honestly think it's ridiculous to come to another conclusion. Other people have come to that conclusion. You are probably not one of those people, so I probably don't have to convince you that it was Paul. But I will throw some of these things out here anyway, because this is some of what is said specifically about, here's why we think maybe it wasn't Paul who wrote Ephesians. So, but just throw some of this stuff out so you know what's out there. So the first thing is, when you look at the style and the vocabulary of Ephesians, there are more than 80 words that are found in Ephesians that you do not find in any other of Paul's letters. And so there's a specific name for this scenario, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because I would botch it completely, and it would only give you an extra thing to laugh at me for. So I'm not going to do that. I know there's plenty more to laugh at me for. Like, for example, my eye is somewhat bruised. I promise Allison did not do that. I actually think it was Ethan Finley. So if you can send Ethan Finley a text and say, hey, we heard you gave Brad a black eye, I'm blaming him. I haven't told him that, but I'm blaming him. Maybe he'll find out on this. So, but when you look at these this group of 80 words or so that are used in Ephesians that aren't used in other writings of Paul, people will say things like, well, then is this thing really written by Paul? Because look at all these words that are used in here that Paul didn't use in his other writings. So it probably couldn't have been him. It couldn't have been him that wrote it. But then at the same time, you've got to go to all the other writings of that same person. So Paul in this instance, and you have to say, okay, well, how many words in those books or those letters are not found in other letters, and start to cross-reference them. So, if you were to do that, and of course these are other letters, writings of Paul that people will say, oh yeah, Paul absolutely wrote those. But Romans and First and Second Corinthians, they contain hundreds of these words that you would say, okay, we can't find those words in others of Paul's writings. Philippians has about 50. Galatians, I think, has about 30. So you can really follow this rabbit all the way down to whichever hole you'd like to. So I think it's kind of a little bit silly of an argument to make it here, but not with some of the other letters that he's written. And then at the same time, are we really going to say that the same person can't use different words in letters to different people in different places? I think that's a little bit crazy. So that's one thing that has been brought up as a possible reason Paul didn't write it. But another one is you have typical words of Paul that are actually missing from Ephesians. So now you look at it the other way. And so you say, well, he says this in his other letters, but boy, he sure doesn't say these things in Ephesians. And they're considered favorite words of Paul because he uses them in a lot of his other letters. And so, there's a whole thing on that. Again, I would still make the same argument that I made with the last one. You're writing to a different group of people. So that certainly can be explained, I think, pretty easily. And then the funny thing is well, I'll say this other one later, but one of the other things that people will say is that when you do have similar language in Ephesians to other writings that we would say, yes, that's definitely Paul's writing, they would say, well, he didn't use those words the exact same way, or use this phrase the same way that he used it, to this other group of people that he was writing to. Words like mystery, stewardship, church, inheritance, possession, fullness, and the list goes on and on. And so they say, well, he kind of used these differently. Well, again, you have to think logically for a second. Is it possible that somebody could use the same words or same phrases, but mean something a little bit different when talking to a different group of people in a different circumstance at a different time? I mean, you could even say it this way. This is writing to the same group of people, but at different periods of time. You could use some of the same words and phrases that really you mean something different by. And not just because words take on different meanings over time, which I think, all have experienced that, but because you're trying to convey a different message, depending on what your audience is going through, or what you're trying to say to them, what message you're really trying to put out there to them. So this other one that I'm just looking at my notes and seeing that I think is kind of funny. People have actually broken down to say, well, here's how many verbs versus how many nouns are used in the book of Ephesians, and boy, that ratio is very different from some of the other letters. So sometimes I think we're scraping the bottom of the barrel to try to say this is not Paul who wrote this. And so, people will bring these issues up, of course, and they're one of the big ones is this letter. It seems more general and not so personal. Paul usually has such a personal letter to the people that he's writing to, and so I get it. I get the argument, and that's it's a valid thing to say, hey, why is this one different than some of the other ones? But I think at some point, again, probably scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to that. There's another commentator who would say, well, really there are a lot of similarities to Paul's other writings in Ephesians, and he would say, when you do this exhaustive study of the style of Ephesians, you see the same language as many of his other epistles, not so much Galatians, but found at the beginning of a lot of his other epistles of prayer and adoration and thanksgiving, and just how similar that is. And so those of us who of course believe in Paul being the author of Ephesians, we would say, well, yeah, we see the similarities more than we would maybe see the differences, but there are really quite a few similarities as well that are important to consider, even though people don't always consider those things. So Paul is the author. I'm not going to argue that. I think it's right there. I think he is directing this particular message to a particular group, and he's going to say it however he has to say it to get his point across. And so you could even argue that if this letter looked like all the other letters that Paul wrote, you could argue and say, well, did somebody just come back later and read all of Paul's writings and then write another letter that was really, really similar, so it would look like it was Paul's writing? So anyway, we could chase that one for a while, but let's not chase that one anymore. Paul's the writer. So now what I'd like to do is I would like to look specifically at some pictures of ancient Ephesus. Let's talk a little bit about ancient Ephesus. And I will preface this with, I am not going to tell you I know what all of these things in ancient Ephesus, all these ruins are now that you'll see pictures of. But I will at least show them because this is the region we're talking about, and I think it's still kind of interesting. This is the first picture of some ruins at Ephesus. I've got quite a few more that I just want to look through real quickly with you. Again, I won't be able to explain every single one because I don't know enough about all of them, but I wanted to show you some pictures of the ruins at Ephesus. This is a really pretty one. I've got quite a few of it, and this is the inside, or right at the entrance of it, and you can see all the detail work and just how pretty and expensive at the time this place would have been. But it's really Really, really pretty. And you can see, this helps you understand too when you see this line here up here with the how hilly it was out there and green it was. Kind of give you an idea of the landscape in the area. This is the theater in Ephesus, which my understanding is actually could hold 25,000 people, which is very, very impressive. A lot of times we don't give enough credit to the ancient people and what they built, but this was pretty incredible. And as is the case with a lot of theaters in the ancient world, no matter where you're sitting, it's like there's not a bad seat in the house in terms of being able to hear everything that's going on stage down here. And so that's obviously a pretty cool thing. Would be real beautiful to see. And you can see some of these columns still standing today. I mean, there's a lot of them right here along the street, the road going all the way here. This road right here is the marble road. Is what they call it. It's really made out of marble. Here's another picture of it right down here that you can see. Amazing that it's still out there today. And then that is of course, artist rendering of the Temple of Artemis. If you're mistaken and you think that's actually going to be there, you'll be very disappointed. Don't book your tickets yet. Not just because it's not there, but it's coronavirus. You probably don't want to go right now to Turkey. So, but yeah, it would have been an amazing structure. One of the seven ancient wonders of the world, or wonders of the ancient world, and just how beautiful that structure would have been, and how much money was put into that, and time and effort was put into it. Pretty amazing. And then here's another picture of the marble road as well. And then this is a really good aerial shot of the theater that we were looking at. It kind of gives you a good idea of where it was situated. Another shot from inside the theater that's real pretty. And then looking at just a couple of maps real quickly. This map, I want to put them up here just to kind of help us get our bearings where we are. Again, you have Ephesus here. This is a very common map I think you've probably seen of Paul's journeys. So that should be no surprise there. Now, this is more of a extra biblical historical reference to the Assyrian Empire and their influence on the world over there in that region. We're going to talk a little bit about that just very, very briefly, but how much power and influence they had. And then this is the Persian Empire, and you can see where they gain Ephesus over here, and Cyrus around 550 to 530 BC. And then you've got the Roman Empire, and typically you would look up here on all these other maps, but Ephesus is right down here. Roman Empire was pretty big as well, and as you can see their influence. And the reason I show these is because we're going to talk here just now about the way Ephesus changed hands so much. So you can see how throughout time these different empires just absolutely took Ephesus over, and really the reason why and what significance that city had in those times. So Ephesus, when we look at the city of Ephesus in history further on, and when we're looking at these different maps, I think it can become obvious that it was just such a coveted region, coveted city. And I don't want to get into way too many of the weeds and the details of the history of Ephesus, but we'll just talk about a couple little things. Ephesus really comes on scene mid-7th century BC. And they were attacked by, I'm going to call them the Cimmerians, could be Cimmerians. I don't know. Cimmerians make sense to me, so that's what I'm going to say. Laugh at me if I've got it wrong. I don't care. That's fine. But they're attacked by them. Now, they withstood that attack. The Cimmerians, though, were people that they were driven out of southern Russia and into Anatolia, and they took over Phrygia, Sardis, and Lydia, but they ultimately couldn't go any further. They didn't take Ephesus. But after that, Ephesus just changes hands constantly. The 6th century, it's run by tyrants. Croesus, I think is his name, from Lydia, was one of them. He did put a lot of money into the Temple of Artemis with golden cows, and it says columns that he put in, but not a good guy at all. Took him over. And then Cyrus of Persia, eventually Ephesus has to submit to him. They kept a good enough relationship with him for about 50 years, but then Xerxes fails in Greece, and then now Ephesus goes to become a tributary of Athens. And then you've got, after that, in 412 BC, roughly, then Ephesus is going to side with Sparta in the Second Peloponnesian War. And they'll be with them for a while, but then you have later on again you've got the pro-Persian tyranny of Syphax, who comes in and takes over, but then Alexander the Great comes right in after them, after him and his family, and in 333 BC kills them, and so Ephesus has this fluctuating fortune over time in history that we can see. They were conquered by a Macedonian general in 286 to 281 BC. Then the Romans ultimately 189, take over Ephesus, and so anyway, in the end, we'll just say it this way. Or I say the Romans took over Ephesus in 189. That's not exactly right. Antiochus the Great was defeated by the Romans in 189. Ephesus ultimately was handed over to the king of Pergamum and then to Rome. But nonetheless, it ended up in Roman hands. And so you just see how Ephesus has just gone through, I would call it turmoil constantly for years and years, hundreds of years, being taken over by one nation, then another, then another. And you really notice why when you look at the map and you see, you kind of take a little closer look, even when you look at the pictures that we saw, just how beautiful it was, how green it was, and I say mountainous, but hilly that it was. Ephesus was an important city. It was a foremost center for the arts and science and religion. It again had one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis, that the Romans would call the Temple of Diana. And Artemis was this goddess of chastity and hunting, wild animals, fertility, forest, and childbirth. A lot of different things. This goddess is, over, evidently. But the Ephesians felt really close to Artemis because they felt like they thought she was born very close by to Ephesus. And so they had this connection with that goddess. But this is in Asia Minor, one of the most outstanding and greatest harbors and trade centers. They had amazing marketplaces in Ephesus. And so this is a really, really important city. And so people wanted this city throughout its history. Ultimately, fast forward quite a few years, and ultimately the Castros River, the mouth of the Castros River, ended up filling with silt, and basically the harbor decayed, and then Ephesus became not such a great city anymore, and really didn't have the appeal or the ability to bring in what it had brought in before, travelers and just the success that it had in the past. It no longer could maintain. So those are some interesting things to me about Ephesus. I wanted to kind of fly through some of those details because I don't want you to glaze over too much. But it is interesting to see how it's changed hands so many times, and really what that city was all about, and how important it was. So for tonight, we're going to stop there, not go any further. This is good for now. But what we are going to do at the beginning of next class is we're going to talk about the beliefs of the people in Ephesus at that time. I think that is an important thing to consider, especially as we look at the message of Ephesians. Why did Paul say the things that he said, and the way that he said them? What is he really, what message is he trying to convey to them? What is he trying to get through to them? It's easier to understand from their perspective when we truly understand, okay, what were their beliefs? How did they view the world? How did they view God? And we'll talk about that next week. So anyway, hopefully that'll be a good continuation of the class we have here, and then we'll of course get into some of the text as well. So I thank you for listening tonight, for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 7 o'clock.